Welcome. Thanks for tuning NeptuneKnives. So this topic is always a sort of subject of contention, but I'm making this video just to put it out there and contribute and hopefully kind of give away, unfortunately, some secrets of knife making and making a good knife, but also at the same time educating people who purchase knives so they kind of know more what they're looking for. Now in this video also especially will help perhaps my customers pick a grind that they would like. While there are a lot of knife makers that have specific grinds they focus on, for me, I'll do convex, I'll do hollow, I'll do whatever is best suited for that task. I'm not biased here, but there's experience through making knives that I want to apply here and explain to you guys. So there's a couple concepts when it comes to knives in general, cutting performance, okay? And we can start first with something called the angle of attack. For example, here is my Yojimbo 2. This is with a 5° on each side, so a 10° inclusive cutting edge. S30V, it'll chip when it starts cutting through heavy materials. It'll start to chip out. It's just, spiracle is a little bit too stiff, but regardless, we can see how this cuts. Now, as you look, a lot of people will say it bites down into the wood really good, right? That's the angle of attack. With this edge geometry, all this stuff going on, still hollow grind, that's how deep and how much of an angle it can go in. On the flip side, I could do an angle of attack just like that, barely skimming the surface. But now let's see this knife not do well. Let's say I just cut straight down in. Much more resistance, and obviously, if I made the angle of attack 90°, we would have really not much of a cut. So first of all, it's important to not be deceived by this. A lot of YouTube videos, a lot of YouTubers, community-wise, will assume that this makes the knife a better cutter, that it can do this angle of attack. And maybe they'll show like a Sabenza or something not be able to go at that angle. So in a sense, you see not that large chunk, but that doesn't mean that the Sabenza is not a good knife. It just means that it cannot achieve that angle, cannot penetrate in very well. It kind of, you can see it breaks the material before it ever even bites into it. So the thing that started this was when I made this SK2 filing knife. I made a V-edge, and I wanted to play it safe. As I test the limits of titanium, I made it 10° both sides, so it's a 20° edge basically. And it's 0 because there's no secondary bevel. And you can see how it cuts into the wood. And I had a hell of a time, and I was thinking, man, why is it when this knife at 35 or 40° and the primary bevel at 25, why did this knife at 20 have more of a trouble getting through than this chisel? And that's where then the second concept, most important to knives, comes in. It's commonly what people refer to as the transition between the edge you sharpen and the primary bevel. Meaning, this is the primary bevel, or the main blade itself and the shape of the blade. And then you have the edge you actually sharpen, which you can see here is very coarse for visual effect. That's the secondary, that's the primary. But that transition between the two, that corner, is called the shoulder. And why do they call this a shoulder? Because it has a shouldering effect. It sort of, you can rest on it. And that's what happens when you cut. So for example, here is a V-edge knife, maybe wider. And some people like to call this the cross section, okay? So you can see on this diagram right here, this corner is the shoulder, okay? Now as you cut through this material, it'll depend on what material you're cutting through. Wood has a tendency to split, but something as difficult as Kydex or something like cardboard has a tendency to bend. And you can see what happens is, as you cut in, the material rests on the shoulder and no longer is allowing the blade edge, the actual cutting edge, to reach the material and continue cutting. So say we have the hinder and we try cutting to the Kydex. It's a very large amount of resistance, and this is the best I can get. And you see the cut has kind of hit a square point, like you can see it's not even like a razor edge at some point. At some point now I'm pushing the shoulder, you can see right there. I'm pushing that shoulder into the Kydex, and that's why it's resisting so much. This is a statement made by Gavco, a fellow YouTuber, that a thinner blade will cut better. And that's true because it has less shoulder, So there's less chance of that effect happening, and the edge will continue cutting and reaching that material and separating it. And now we look though at convex. Same concept. With less of a shoulder, less of a corner, and it's rounded off, there's also less of a likelihood for the material to snag or rest on the shoulders. Chisels. Why does the chisel perform so well, yet such thick stock? My knives are 5mm, but they're chisel, because a chisel only has one shoulder. So in essence, there's no possible way for it to shoulder itself or get stuck. And so that's that feeling when you're cutting through something and it's like, it's just jammed because it's resting on the shoulders. But with the chisel, if you adjust the angle of attack, you can always get the edge to continue cutting. You might cut at this angle, but it will continue cutting, and that provides a lot of versatility. The other final option is to make an exact match. To know that the intention of the knife maybe perhaps is to cut wood, and so you could match that. But obviously there are some drawbacks to having such a thin edge. But you can see in all the representations. What cuts is the secondary bevel, the actual angle of the edge. The rest of the knife, everything above the shoulder, doesn't even touch the material. Now where does the rest of the blade come into play? On the hollow grind, a lot of tactical knife makers, Janich, Szabo, Terzula, they use hollow grinds. And part of that reason is because the angle of attack. By having less of material here, if this is the first shoulder, the second shoulder is the final primary bulk up here. And with a hollow grind, in a tactical situation when you're slashing at something, you can't control the angles. You know, if I'm cutting into wood right now on this camera, I can control cutting this way or that way. But when it comes to a fight and you slash, you want that second shoulder up here to not cause the knife to shoulder itself. And so that sense, that hollow grind allows the material to, if you can see here, allows more of an angle option or variety and still continue slicing and get the most impact without facing resistance here at the shouldering point. Now the next question would be, why a symmetrical or asymmetrical grind? When I was in Japan and through my martial arts training and messing with weaponry, you know, you notice a trend here. And for me, I stick with tradition. And if you look traditionally speaking at the Japanese, you can see when it comes to a samurai sword, a large knife, it's going to have a V-edge or convex and a large portion for the strength and the weight. When it comes to utility blade, they would traditionally use something like kiridashi or a chisel. Obviously the chisel, when it comes to something compact and lightweight, I feel the chisel is the best. Because one, it allows you to have a very strong edge. You could set 40 degrees and it still perform well. For example, if you run into something that you need to cut at an angle of attack that unfortunately your knife cannot handle, then you can always adjust the angle and go at a more shallow angle. And that kind of versatility in the chisel, the fact that it doesn't shoulder itself so easily, creates a very versatile tool. I think that's why historically the chisel has proven itself. So now where then does a double grind come in? Swords, machetes, axes. If you look at those traditionally now, the reason why is it allows more thickness to stay throughout the blade. If they were both 30, this one goes higher up the blade. This one stops halfway because you divide it onto each side. And it's something very noticeable when I was making the difference between the arbiter here with 25 and this one with a 10 degree. And you can see the height of the primary bevel. On the arbiter, it's a little bit less, around ½ inch, and it's just barely over ½ inch, but the degree difference, this didn't go up this high. If this knife was a chisel, and I was forced to remove all the material from just one side, this bevel would be twice the height. Then what would happen is, through a larger portion of the knife, it would continue thinning and thinning and thinning, and you would lose that thickness right around here, and that shoulder that you want, especially in an impact weapon, such as a machete, a sword, something you want very, very strong. And at the same time, traditionally, when you get towards larger knives, you want some weight. The purpose is that weight aids you in chopping and cutting and severing. That's one of the primary reasons why to go from a chisel to V-edge. But you can also see with the chisel though, again, the fine point, the edge angle, and the tip. If you were to increase this primary bevel to more of a high angle like 35, you will get a stronger tip, but then you will have even less options for angle of attack. So in that sense, it becomes a point where when you want a stronger tip, even though this is only a total of 20, it has more width because it's allowing more bolt to continue through because the bevel height is not as high. See then, Japanese tradition, a chisel for utility, and then a V-edge for something more stout and for combat. You know, when I make these titanium knives for EDC, they are EDC blades. They are not meant to pry. I'm going to make a Tonto version that will allow that. Now what you'll see a lot of knife makers do to sort of compensate because of the shouldering effect on a V-edge knife, they'll just continue taking the edge angle of the primary bevel up, or lower basically, to a full flat grind. It's just finding the fact that as a compact EDC, a chisel will cut more easily because it has less of a shouldering effect than a V-edge knife. And so what V-edge knives makers tend to do, you know, perhaps go full flat, or they will go for a thin profile, or they will convex the shoulder, you know, and all those methods do aid in that. The next thing would be the properties of the metal the knife maker is choosing. This isn't so much a limitation as just what are the goals. Titanium can't achieve a very low edge angle such as my 10-degree Spyderco Yojimbo 2, which is S30V. That's why knife makers such as me and Warren Thomas have to do the higher edge angle of 35 or something right around here, and then go for a chisel for it to still perform well because of the less shouldering. The final thing to consider would be the end user or the knife maker. For example, Emerson likes chisels because they are easier to sharpen. You only have to sharpen one side, you're always going to have an edge in line, and they're tactical in the sense of versatile. They allow for a variety of penetrating cutting. Hollow proves itself with its sharpening life, as stated by Chris Reeves, because the edge tends to cave in right behind the initial shoulder. So as you sharpen it, this shoulder will not widen. And also then the hollow grind, you know, as used by Sabo, Janich, Terzula, you know, these tactical knife makers, they like the hollow because of that ability to have different angles of attack. Then the V-edge, you know, Strider, Hinder, they're always going to use the V-edge. That's because it will always matter that little bit of material backing up the cutting edge. I mean, for example, when I have my titanium knife and I set it at 20 degrees, the edge deforms. And then the difference between that and 25, the edge doesn't deform. We're talking 5 degrees of difference. It's so minute you can't even see it by eye. And then you can see here that loss by convexing the shoulder off. That small little difference has an effect. And I would say here, obviously, a convex then effect would be great on a thicker knife because it doesn't really matter on such a thick stock. But on a thinner knife, that little bit of shoulder is something wanted because it provides stability to the cutting edge and the material. And the thing is, as knife makers and professionals such as Hinder and Strider and Chris Reeves, customers are paying for precision. They pay for the precise edge angle, the precise bevel angle, and the consistency between all of them. Because it's easy for a customer or user convex the shoulder off, semi-convex it by removing the shoulder, or actually convex the entire blade if they wanted to. But customers pay for precision. The flats show the flaws, and that's a kind of a knife maker rule, is this flat shows grinding errors. You know, the crisp lines of a flat really show whether or not a knife maker was able to get a consistent grind going throughout. By convexing, it's more overall. You put it on a flex belt and you kind of just run it across, and eventually you just kind of work out the whole area and you just kind of eyeball it in a sense.